I'm going to hit broadcast. Good afternoon. We're going to get started in about a minute, so just hold tight. Greetings and welcome to the CCOF Foundation Biodynamic 101 webinar for growers. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. We are pleased to partner with Demeter USA to host this introductory webinar. If you're having difficulties connecting to the webinar, if you can't hear or can't see, please call our office for support at 831-423-2263. Press 0 for the operator and someone will help you connect to the webinar. My name is Megan Donovan. I'll be your host today. I'm an education specialist at the CCOF Foundation. The CCOF Foundation advances organic agriculture for a healthy world through education and hardship grants, technical assistance, and consumer education. Behind the scenes today, we have Adrian Fisher, the CCOF Foundation's program manager, providing webinar technical assistance. He'll be the one fielding questions when they come in and may hop on as an alternative host if any technical issues should arise. We also have Kelly Corman from CCOF Certification Services online today. She's here to answer any complex organic certification questions that may come up during the question and answer session of the webinar. Before we get started with the main presentation, I wanted to let you know how you can participate in today's web event. To see the Zoom webinar controls, move your mouse over the image of the shared screen. If you're in the full screen viewing mode and would prefer to view the webinar in a window, click on the View Options tab at the top of the shared screen, select Exit Full Screen Mode and to exit the full screen. Throughout the webinar, we'll stop from time to time for questions and answers. To send questions or to communicate with our webinar staff, click on the Q&A icon at the bottom of the shared screen. The question and answer box will pop open. Move it to the side of your screen if it blocks the view of the webinar. Write your questions or comments into the field on the bottom of the box and click send. If you would like to send your question anonymously, click the Send Anonymously box on the left. Note, we will not be using the chat function during this webinar, so send all messages via the question and answer box. And feel free to send questions during any point in time in the webinar. We'll collect those and then address them during the question and answer sessions. At the end of the webinar, an invitation to take our webinar evaluation will pop up. To take the survey, click on the link to answer a few quick questions. Your feedback helps us improve our offerings and get ideas for future trainings. As a final reminder, today's webinar is being recorded and everyone will receive an email with a link to view today's recording of event. And just a note, we have a really big crowd today. We have over 100 folks online, which is great. We're really excited that there's this much interest in biodynamics. And we're gonna try to get to as many questions as we can. And just a note that if we don't get to your specific question, please follow up with us afterwards, since there are many people. We may not get to yours. And likewise, if you're having technical issues and kind of sending in some technical questions, we will get to you as soon as we can, but appreciate your patience. So thanks again for attending today. And with that, I'd like to introduce our two speakers. Evrett Lunquist serves as the Director of the Demeter Association. Serves as the certification director at the Demeter Association. He has managed a diverse biodynamic produce farm integrated with livestock in southeast Nebraska with his wife and kids since 1996. In 2001, Evrett expanded the scope of his involvement with biodynamics by becoming an inspector with Demeter USA. In addition to inspecting biodynamic farms and processors, Evrett has served as an inspector for numerous organic certifiers and has extensive inspection training from the International Organic Inspectors Association. And we also have Rudy Marchesi, who's a partner and past president of Montanora Estate in Oregon's Willamette Valley. Rudy is a first-generation Italian-American from a family of farmers originating in Lombardia. He has been growing grapes and making wine since the early 70s. In search of the wine's holy grail, he arrived in Oregon's Willamette Valley in 1998 to consult and eventually purchase the Montanora Estate, where he converted the farm to certified organic and biodynamic and has become a leader in Oregon's biodynamic community. Rudy serves as a chairman of the Demeter Association Board of Directors. So Evrett and Rudy, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. And to start off, Rudy, we'll start with you.
Okay, thank you, Megan. All right, today, what I'd like to start with is just a simple overview of what is biodynamics, how it formed, and some of the very basic principles. So it was started and conceived of by a gentleman named Rudolf Steiner, coincidentally this very week in 1924. So it's an older certified standard of agriculture that arose out of a period when there was the emergence of chemical fertilizers. After World War I, there was a growth of the use of nitrogen fertilizers because they were able to turn munitions plants into nitrogen fertilizer plants. It was very cheap and farmers embraced it. But not long afterwards, they started noticing that they were needing more and more of it to get the same results. And the overall health and vitality of their farms wasn't as good as it had been. So a group of farmers turned to Rudolf Steiner, who was a very prominent philosopher at that time, and presented their problem. And what he came up with was this method of farming that created a system where the nutritional inputs could be sourced right from the farm or the surrounding farm. Kind of the original regenerative, sustainable movement kind of farming, but in a very detailed way with some somewhat esoteric ideas, but very practical at the same time. So let's see here. Click on that and I do this, something ought to happen. All right. Yeah, so we talked about that. One of the basic tenets of this biodynamic concept is that you view the farm as a single living organism. It kind of predated, but followed the same logic of the thought process of ecology that we think of these days. So what Steiner talked about was you think about the farm above ground, below ground, the hedgerows, the wildlife, all of that is being part of this organism that you want to bring health and vitality to. And then the parts that you want to harvest thereby are sharing in that health and vitality. It was a kind of a forward way of looking at it, but very, very practical as we can think about it now. And when we look at our cutting edge farming practices. Wow. I'm having trouble with these slides.
Yeah, if you want, I'm happy to move them forward for you.
All right, if you would.
Yeah, no problem.
There we go. Okay, so biodynamics caught on in Europe early on, and then gradually spread all kinds of agriculture. You know, we think of it in the United States often as related to wine, but when you talk to growers around the world, which I have the good fortune of doing at the annual conference every year in Switzerland, every form of agriculture has people participating in this and practicing, be it dairy or vegetable or coffee, tea, as well as wine, fruit production, large animal, small animal, etc. Because health and the health of the organism, the health of the farm is universal for whatever crops we're doing. In the United States, Demeter was formed in 1995, and it was even before the NOP standards were established. So it's been around for a while, and now we have an international organization that we align with and work closely with, not only in governance, but also in standards and farming practices. So it's a big movement around the world, just not so big in the United States at the moment. Let's go on to the next slide there. So there's a lot of similarities with organic and biodynamic. I mean, like most people, I certified our farm NOP organic a couple of years before we went whole hog, no pun intended, into the biodynamic practices. But you know, similarities are we're not putting any harmful chemical inputs, not only in the farming, but in the processing, in our case, winemaking. And that includes cleaning agents and yeasts and all the like. We also have standards in farming that you may not think about, but aside from the inputs that you use for nutrition or pest control or whatever, you know, there's also certain standards regarding, you know, you're not going to be dripping hydraulic fluid all over your farm and things like that. So it gets into some detail. As I said, there's a shared awareness with organic of harnessing the living process of the farm, bringing the life to the soil, bringing the health to the soil, bringing that vitality and a robust microcosm in the soil as well as above ground. And then there's concerns for protecting the overall environment in all of our practices and products. So, you know, water systems and, you know, the water table, as well as streams that may be flowing by or through our farms, the air, and as well as the people that are working on the farm. So those are similarities. There's some differences, though, that that I should highlight. In biodynamic farming, Steiner gave us these formulas for additional nutritional inputs that we now refer to as preparations. And they're an essential and required part of the farming practices. They are sourced from very simple compounds that we can get around our farm. I mean, cow manure, pulverized silica, you know, oak bark, chamomile, dandelion, a lot of plant materials, but they're treated in very specific ways, composted in certain ways. We make teas in a very specific way, and they're applied either through compost or through sprays at specific times during the year as nutritional inputs, as substances to not only enhance the health and vitality of our crops, but also of the microbiome, everything that lives in the root zone and around. We also pay attention to the rhythms of our environment, of our larger environment. Either, I mean, I think everyone knows that you know, moon phases affect water flow, but there's a lot of other influences that are subtle, but yet when you add them all together, have an effect on the success of your operation. So we pay attention to those. We have calendars that'll tell us, you know, good days for doing things and not so good days, and give us some guidance there. Also, as I said, this view of the farm as one living organism is an underpinning of all of our practices, and that's something that we keep in mind when we make decisions, when we do practices. It's all about the whole farm and how are we making it healthy. And then the last thing is that not all OMRI listed inputs are allowed in biodynamics. You know, we don't allow obvious things like GMO products, but there's other things we investigate, the manufacturing of these products, and if they have materials or processes that we don't feel are in line with biodynamic farming, we won't allow them to be used. It's not very often, but there are exceptions to that OMRI listing that we insist upon. What do we have next? Well, questions. Okay.
Great, thank you. So yeah, we'll open it up for questions, and in the next section, Everett's going to go much more in depth into the requirements for biodynamic certification, and then at the end, Rudy will go into some case studies and talk a little bit more about preparations. So if anybody has any questions right now, more about the history or the big picture of biodynamics, feel free to write those in. And Rudy, could you talk a little bit more about how the biodynamic standards are governed? With organic, it's a federal regulation, and you know there's a whole process with the National Organic Standards Board. But as an international organization, how are the biodynamic standards
I hear you.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's a really good question, because while we do have an international body with an international set of standards, they vary somewhat from country to country, because we recognize that there are different sets of circumstances. And this is a hot topic of conversation for us at Demeter US, because there's certain things that say Demeter International would allow, but are not even allowed in NOP standards. So we want the Demeter to be in line with NOP as much as possible. So there are a few things that Demeter International allows that we don't allow. I know in my world, which is grapes and wine, the international standards are more lenient than the Demeter standards for winemaking, and so we have the ability and the rights to create our own standards here in the U.S. But for the most part, we're in alignment with the international standards. Every year there's a review and a discussion of, you know, what's the same, what's similar, what's different, and what's the logic behind that, because we're always striving to create a set of standards that in the end are healthy for the farm and the environment and the people that farm.
Great, thank you. And then another question that came in was, do you have any suggestions on where to find planting calendars?
Yeah, there's an organization that's kind of one-stop shopping for all kinds of things. The Josephine Porter Institute in Floyd, Virginia. They make preparations. They have a great amount of information on things, and they sell a calendar. The one I like the best is either the Stella Natura calendar or the Maria Thun, Thun calendar. And I believe they sell both of those, as well as other publications and books. So that's the Josephine Porter Institute in Virginia, Floyd, Virginia. It's a really good source.
Great, thank you. And we have some questions coming in that I think may be answered in the next section. So I think what we're going to do is we'll just move on to the next section, and that's going to go over kind of the requirements on certification and some of the livestock and biodynamic preparations. So Rudy, thanks for the introduction, and I'm gonna transfer the presentation over to Evrett, and we can kind of get some of those more detailed certification questions answered. And again, we'll be hearing from Rudy again at the end of the presentation. So Rudy, thanks for your first half of the presentation, and we look forward to the second half.
You're welcome.
So Evrett, thanks again for joining us this afternoon, and sounds like folks are very excited to hear more about some of the requirements for Demeter certification.
Glad to be here. Thanks for putting us on. So I have a small farm in southeast Nebraska. I have a minor role now, and we have a little bit more than an acre in vegetables. We've had as much as 3.5, but been certified for a while now, as I've already been introduced, and glad to be here. Okay. So I thought about starting out with a reflection here on biodynamic, and if you take the word biodynamic and break it into its roots, you end up with bio and dynamic, and in other words, life plus forces. And when working with biodynamic methods, we are asked to consider the living dynamics in a plant or an animal, and even our very own nutrition. Life is more than a complex chemical reaction. Life is defying gravity and inertia, and it's easy to recognize in an animal that's walking around. It's easy to recognize that the animal's alive. When a plant's growing in the ground, it's easy to recognize that the plant's alive. Harvested crops still have contain life forces as well, and sometimes I find that observations come unexpectedly, and this picture on the screen is one of them. I pulled a mustard plant out of a lilac hedge and laid it on the ground, and then came back 2 days later, and we had some cloudy, cool, moist weather, and so the plant did not wilt. And I noticed that the flowers had gone from their upright form, laying sideways, had turned up on the plant. And it was very striking to me that the plant was still alive, and the life forces were still there. And so these are things that start to creep into your consciousness when you start thinking about biodynamic methods. So getting into the Demeter Biodynamic Farming Standards and the certification. So again, revisiting this core topic of biodynamic certification, and this is from the standards, and looking at the biodynamic farming involves managing a farm utilizing the principles of a living organism. And the concise model of a living organism ideal would be a wilderness forest, where there's a high degree of self-sufficiency and in all realms of biological survival. So you have the leaves in the canopy that drop in the fall. They decompose, become part of the fertility in the soil. They go back up into the canopy. There's insects, there's animals involved in the ecosystem. Nature is the example here for kind of like a perfect farm organism, and we strive to attain that in biodynamic farming, but farming is one step removed from wilderness, and so we have some practices that we bring in to ensure the vitality is maintained in the farm. It was mentioned just a little bit briefly that biodynamic farming could be viewed as the original regenerative agriculture dating back to the 1920s, and that there's a high ideal of generating all your inputs from within the farm itself. So Breaking the standards down into principles, we have roughly 7 principles here. Biological diversity, generating fertility on the farm, on-farm water and waterway conservation, biodynamic preparations and the wider connections of the farm in the world and the cosmos, generating disease, insect, and weed control from on the farm, within the farm, integrating livestock into the farm, and then after all this is all said and done, there's a requirement for gentle post-harvest handling in the end when the harvested crops get turned into the process. These are all interconnected and represented in our standards. I'm going to touch on each one of them briefly. We have biological diversity. So on the farm, we're going to be looking at preserving some wild biodiversity reserve areas. 10% of the farm is required to be either set aside as a biodiversity reserve area, or other areas can be planted, say with flowering insect, flowering plants that benefit the insect communities. In a vineyard, this could be planting the aisles in with these flowering plants. It could be having an area that is specifically developed for encouraging insects on the farm and providing their needs, whether it be nectar and pollen, habitat, prey, for instance, for the predatory insects, genetic diversity on the farm. That can also occur in the variety of seeds that are planted, as well as the type of seeds. Of course, the soil needs to have diversity as well. And generating fertility on the farm. Integrating livestock is a really nice way to do that. It's actually a requirement in the biodynamic standards. There are exemptions that are allowable if the livestock cannot be certified to the Demeter standard. There's an exemption that can be requested. We still look at how the animals are treated on the farm, that there's no, making sure that there's not going to be prohibited materials coming into the farm through the animals. And then there's an exemption that can be requested for folks that don't want to have animals on their farm for one reason or another. If that's the case, then there needs to be a good effort made to bring fertility development within the farm. So green manures, making compost out of green manures or green chop or things like that, that sort of thing. But regardless, green manures are another good way for improving the soil fertility. You know, you can grow it and provide carbon for the soil. You can provide nitrogen in the form of legumes. Composting is one of the kind of the central themes of a biodynamic farm. It's where the biodynamic compost preparations are applied, and then that biodynamic compost is then spread on the rest of the farm, bringing the influence of the preparations out to the soil and the plants, and then even the animals. Yes, and so then we also okay, just trying to get rid of a bar on my screen. Let's see. So minimum tillage is another way to preserve fertility on the farm, maintaining the soil structure, using it as it's needed, but not in excess. And then of course, there's also fertility effects with the biodynamic preparations. And the picture here is the horn manure and then the horn silica. Those are both field sprays. And we'll talk about those some more in a bit. We're looking at on-farm water and waterway conservation. And we're making sure that manure management in proximity to groundwater and surface water is treated in a way that it doesn't contaminate the waterways. If irrigation practices are used, we're looking at pump efficiency. If you're using water from a fish-bearing waterway, then we're looking at whether the intakes have screens. Riparian area preservation and management is looked at. The biodynamic standards also are in line with the salmon safe standards. So if you're in a salmon bearing waterway area, then the biodynamic standards address that. There's a big importance with developing the humus levels in your soil, because humus will absorb so much more water than just the base soil itself. Another thing that we look at maybe with mulching for weed control and water conservation, and then also frequency and use of irrigation. Okay. Waterway protection and manure handling. I touched on this just a little bit, but Demeter certification requires that barnyard manure be carefully collected, preserved, and composted. And if livestock are in a confinement situation, say like a barnyard for winter time feeding, then manure storage is looked at, and facilities must be designed to keep redirect water from going through that area. Livestock are not allowed to be in confinement on an ongoing way, so CAFO situations are not an option with Demeter certification. Storage facilities for the manure need to be not within a floodplain or in areas with shallow groundwater tables. And then if there is runoff from roofs or surface flows or overflowing waterers, these need to be diverted away from the manure piles. And so a little bit more about the biodynamic preparations. Horn silica and horn manure are both field sprays. Sometimes the horse tail is also applied as a field spray. And they each have different purposes. The horn manure is based on trying to encourage soil vitality, soil microbes, earthworms, humus development. And then kind of on the opposite end of the polarity there, horn silica is being applied as a mist to the air above the plants. And it's a foliar application, and it's more geared at how the plants utilize sunlight. And it enhances sugar development in the plants and flavor development, and those two preparations are kind of a balance to each other. The other preparations, the yarrow, the chamomile, stinging nettle, bark, dandelion, and valerian, are all applied to the compost piles. And in order to qualify for biodynamic certification, 500 and the 501, or the horn manure and the horn silica, need to be applied to all crop production annually. And then the 502 to the 507 is applied in the first year, and then at least within every 3 years to the soil via the compost, or we have compound preparations that have the preparations in them as well. The horsetail is applied as needed, and it's more of a kind of a preventative for addressing plant disease issues, fungal attacks, that sort of thing. So a lot of people have heard of the biodynamic preparations when it comes to horn manure, and that one is a little bit easier to understand in terms of the intentions there. But I thought it'd be worthwhile going into another compost preparation to kind of understand what's the basis of these preparations, how do they work, and why they are the way they are. Ideally, these preparations are going to be made on the farm, but there are organizations that do sell them, and they're available for purchase if needed. The way kind of to think about these biodynamic preparations are similar to homeopathy, and it's for the earth. And it's not unlike how a homeopath or a naturopath would be using a homeopathic remedy for a human being. And so the yarrow preparation, or 502, is made by harvesting yarrow blossoms in the summer and then placing them into a stag's bladder. And then they're hung in the summer sun and then buried in the ground during the wintertime. And then they're retrieved in the spring. And then approximately 1 teaspoon of this material, this humified kind of yarrow blossom material, is added to 15 tons or up to 15 tons of compost materials. And all these preparations, kind of like they're all made a little bit differently, but again, it comes down to about 1 teaspoon for up to 15 tons of compost. And so that's a very, very small amount of material affecting a very large pile of compost materials. And the way that these materials influence the pile, you need to kind of step into a larger picture of how the plant works and how nature works. And so Rudolf Steiner used a method called the Goethean scientific method of Goethean scientific observation. And it was about seeing not only the nutrient profile of a plant, but also the process that works in the plant. Like if you analyze a yarrow plant, there's going to be a high amount of potassium in the plant, even though the soil may have very low. And so the plant, the yarrow plant, has an ability, an affinity to a very unique relationship to potassium, to gather this from the environment, even though it's in very small amounts in the soil. So there's something going on with the plant. It has a unique relationship to potassium, and you're observing the process that the plant has with the potassium. It's not just the potassium nutrient, but it's also the potassium process. And then the question comes, well, why a stag's bladder? And for that, we go back to some old world wisdom that Steiner was aware of, and he thought it was very important to not throw out the wisdom that's of this ancient wisdom and just use the scientific materialistic perspective that we have now. What we should be doing is we should be bringing these two things together so that we have the ancient wisdom combined with the modern scientific perspective. And so there's an old world verse that I think is a nice tie-in here. And it goes, "Thou pretty herb of Venus tree, thy true name is yarrow. Now who my bosom friend may be, pray tell thou me tomorrow." And the verse touches on the belief then that if you ate yarrow prior to going to bed, you would dream about your future partner. And so there's this connection in the old world, a very strong connection to like a love connection. And in the older world, the connection of love was tied to the goddess Venus. And if you go back, yarrow is also tied with Venus in this little verse, "O Venus tree." And so there's a strong connection between potassium, like an animal or a human being. Urine has a strong role in regulating a person's blood potassium, and there's also a connection here with emotion, the goddess Venus. And then if you think about whether you have to if you're nervous, you have you either have to pee or you can't pee. And so there's these connections that are made that kind of draw from an older wisdom, and yet there's still a scientific connection. And so all these things come together with this preparation here. And the way it's being brought into the pile is that it's a radiant effect in the pile rather than a purely materialistic effect. So, but the preparations are very interesting to say nonetheless. When it comes to stirring the biodynamic field sprays, there's a certain process. You stir them for an hour. So the horn manure and the horn silica are stirred for an hour, and they're stirred by creating a vortex in one direction, and then you break the vortex and then stir in the other direction, and you do this back and forth for an hour. And your stirring method is going to be determined by the amount of spray that you need. A small garden could be stirred in a 5-gallon bucket. Larger, it's going to take a larger container, and then there's also up to larger acreages are going to need to have stirring machines to help in the process. Some people actually use what are called flow forms, which it kind of has this very gentle lemniscape type effect on the water as the water flows through them. So then another principle here, on-farm disease control. Again, diversity is going to have a big influence here. Having the right diversity on the farm, having predator habitat, having balanced nutrition in the soil, and then good airflow is also important. Diversity, understanding the pest cycles on the farm, also understanding the beneficial insect cycles on the farm and encouraging those in what those insects need to thrive on your farm. Because if they don't have it on your farm, they're going to go somewhere else. So we do allow commonly allowed pest control products, but we do have restrictions on how they can be used and when they can be used, and that we require that they have there's attention being paid to the beneficial insects that might be affected by them. So that's another factor that we consider. And with the integration of livestock as a requirement, we're looking at not only a fertility source, but they can be used for weed control, pest control, as well as encouraging the humus development within the soil. If there's a limitation on how much livestock can be had, it's encouraged that a cow is kept so that the horn manure preparation can be made on the farm from the manure. And in terms of documentation, it's going to be fairly similar to what's required for the NOP organic, but we do have also some forms that we need filled out. In addition to that, we have a biodynamic system plan that covers all these principles and how they're addressed on the farm. Crop plan, a list of inputs, and the list goes there. We also have a required biodynamic seed search, similar to the organic, but requiring organic, and then organic, requiring biodynamic, then organic, and then conventional if that's not available. Okay. Typical timeline. It's been roughly 4 to 6 months from beginning to end. And it's a similar process to certified organic of submitting the required documentation, getting an initial review of that, and then we assign it for inspection when it's cleared within the office. We try to have a standalone or dual inspection with the preference of a dual inspection. We've worked with most certifiers to make the dual inspection happen. There's an inspection report, and submitted documents are evaluated, and then the decision gets made, and then the certificate is issued. So what to expect with biodynamic certification? Demeter farming practices flourish on the foundation of sound organic farming methods. And then something that farmers often report, and I've seen it on my own farm, is that the crops or the produce store longer. They have better storage life, the flavors increased, better nutrition or increased nutritional content, and customers just have a preference for biodynamic produce when they taste it and they eat it. Biodynamic grapes and wines are recognized and prized among wine critics for their unique terroir development. And there's also an opportunity to gain insights into the living phenomena on your farm and within the larger surroundings, when you're contemplating these biodynamic methods. The process of applying and reapplying for biodynamic certification are going to prompt you to look at your farm as that living organism and how it can be made more in line with that ideal of having a self-contained farm organism in a regenerative manner. In terms of costs, there's going to be some additional costs. Like I said, we've worked with most organic certifiers and coordinating dual inspections. This year has really been throwing a interesting twist with inspections in the COVID situation, but we're all remaining as flexible as we can. And so there's the kind of the outline of what costs you can expect for Demeter certification. And some resources. The Demeter Association is the certifier of biodynamic agriculture in the United States. And we have a list, if you need, of sources of biodynamic preparations to use. On our website, we also have a link to the standards that you can access. And there's links to the standards there. The Biodynamic Association is a membership and educational organization in the United States that lists has a list of regional groups in the area practicing biodynamics, and they get together, and some make preparations and some have educational events. And then typically the Biodynamic Association puts on a conference every year. This year a little bit unusual. There's also scientific studies that have been done on biodynamics that both Demeter and the Biodynamic Association have listed on websites. And that's questions now.
Great, thank you, Everett, for that overview and kind of getting a little more into the details about what's required for biodynamic certification. So we want to open it up to questions for Everett, and had one come in during the presentation. Wondering a little more about the livestock requirements for biodynamic and whether native wildlife can serve the purpose of having animals, or if the livestock is required.
Yeah, we don't see the native animal or the wildlife animals as really a kind of a managed part of the farm. They're certainly going to have an influence, but the preference is to have the livestock be managed as a part of the farm.
Great, thank you. And then someone also was wondering whether the biodynamic calendars that Rudy was talking about earlier, if they're required for biodynamic certification.
Right. The calendars are not a requirement. It's an encouragement to kind of pay attention, be observant about the things that are at work in the farm and outside the farm and how they influence things, but it's not a certification requirement.
Okay, and they're also wondering if sort of the reasoning behind that, why if it wasn't required, why it's not required.
There's kind of a unique relationship, I guess, between a person and the world, and it's and there's been some research on the influences of the cosmic influences, and the results are consistent with some and not consistent with others, and so it'd be difficult to, at this point, without that consistency, to have a requirement, and so that's why it's an encouragement at this point.
Great, thank you.
And I will bring up, in terms of the livestock, there is also the option of cooperating with neighboring or nearby farms that have livestock on a biodynamic farm. So if you're not having livestock your own self, then you could cooperate. And we look at how the livestock are kept on the neighboring farm, but there's the option of collaborating with neighbors for getting the influence of manure and animals on your farm.
Great, thanks. That's good to know. And another question was wondering, is biodynamic land management comparable with regenerative agriculture, and also compatible with it?
I would say it's very compatible. I would say it's almost I would say it's inherent that the ideal of biodynamic farming is to be regenerative at its base. The ideal biodynamic farm is going to have fertility generated from within itself, and whether it be with legumes and cover crops and livestock and compost piles and the moving of things around the farm with those types of systems. Yes, it's very, very compatible with regenerative.
Great, thank you. Someone else was wondering whether municipal recycled water is allowed for irrigation under biodynamic certification.
That's a question I haven't considered before, but I don't think so. I don't think it would be.
Okay. And then what's the biodynamic approach to managing urban pests like rats that eat the crops?
Right. It's similar. You start similar with organic. I mean, traps are an option. Baits have limited use, and then Steiner does outline a method called pest peppering, which is a gathering of the pest and then creating like a trap. You trap the animal, make an ash out of the animal, and then spread the ash. That's kind of, people have experimented with that over the years, and there's been reported good success, and but that's not in the standards at this point.
Okay, thank you. And someone else was wondering how one manages the food safety and livestock on a biodynamic farm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, with biodynamic, organic is used as the base, and so the same requirements for manure use on land are found in organic and the biodynamic standard. So there's that time separation, a post-harvest interval of 90 or 120 days, depending on the crop. And so that's still there, and that's a requirement.
Great, and kind of a follow-up to that, they were wondering, is it possible to include animals for a few months in the dormant season of a crop to meet the Demeter standards?
Yes, we have operations that do that quite regularly, a part of their regular routine. You know, vineyards have a dormant period, and either sheep or chickens going into the vineyard when the crops are not growing is a way to incorporate livestock into the system.
Great, thanks. So I think we're going to take 2 more questions and then move on to Rudy's second half of the presentation. So another person was wondering, why do you recommend to keep a farm history for 36 months?
The Demeter standards require that that crops cannot be grown in the same field for more than 2 years in a row for annuals, and so that 3-year history gives us the basis to verify that that's not happening. And then there's also the 3-year history as a base with the NOP organic, and that you have to meet the organic standard in order to become certified biodynamic. And so we do have the option in the United States of certifying a farm just Demeter. And so in that case, then we would be verifying all the NOP organic requirements in order to verify that the farm's eligible for Demeter certification.
Great, thank you. So I have a couple final questions that are a good sort of leeway into Rudy's next half of the presentation, and those are around the silica preparation. So Evrett, if you want to chime in, and Rudy, if just maybe want to pay attention and you can elaborate a little more in your presentation. And Evrett, feel free to just defer to Rudy too. But people were wondering a little more about how the silica is prepared and applied, kind of the amounts per acre, and then also wondering, wanting to know a little more about the purpose and function of the silica from the plant biology and soil amendment side, but also from the lunar cyclical energetic approach. And the person who wrote this in recognized that that might be a very big topic to cover on this webinar. So if you have any references or links to readings or research or on this topic, they would appreciate that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, one of my favorite books that I got started with was called Culture and Horticulture, and the author's is Wolf Storl, S-T-O-R-L. Covers a lot of these, a lot of this in that book, and it's a nice beginning book to understand. In terms of rates, the horn manure is applied at only a 1/4 cup, mixed in 3 gallons of water on an acre. Horn silica is applied at about 1/8 of a teaspoon in 1 gallon of water, and it's sprayed into kind of like up into the air, so it settles down on the plant leaves, and as a fine mist. And that one's in the early morning. The horn manure is applied in the afternoon, so very, very small amounts over a whole acre. The purpose of the silica is to enhance the relationship of the plant with the sun and the sunlight, and enhance the chlorophyll process, improvement of flavors, and there is a little bit of a tie-in with lunar. Like if you're applying silica, it's recommended, like all the constellations have an affiliation with the elemental. So we have fire, air, water, and earth. And plants are going to have a particular relationship with one of those elements. And if you apply your silica on a day that's, say, like a fruit, like tomato fruit, best to do it on a fire day. You know, it's going to bring another quality to the application. So there's a lot going on there.
Great, thank you. That's really interesting, and thanks for the recommendation for the book. So So I think we're going to transfer to the final half of the presentation. And if you have more questions for Everett, we'll have another question and answer session at the end. So feel free just to send those in. And Everett, thank you again for that really great overview and some good details about the biodynamic preparations and also the standards. So Rudy, if we can get to the second half of your presentation, and I'm happy to move the slides for you again, if that is helpful for you.
All right. So one of the things that Steiner did in his agricultural lectures was to help us understand the life of the plant using sort of anthropomorphological analogies. And he showed a picture of a plant in its upside down form like this. And this happens to be a grapevine because that's what I do. But and he talked about the plant and the life of the plant and the activity of the plant. And he compared the root system to the human head, where the thought process occurred and where the sensitivity and the sensing organs are so heavily concentrated. And he said, you know, the roots of the plants, as we know, are the most critical. And without that, the plant does not survive. And he also emphasized that's why it's so important to pay attention to what's going on underground, what your microbiome is, what organisms are interacting with your plants, because it's a critical part of the plant, the entire plant process. He also emphasized and pointed out that plants like us have respiratory systems where they're breathing in CO2 and breathing out oxygen, and that's a constant part of their life cycle. They have circulatory systems just like we do, where they're moving fluids from the tips of their root hairs all the way up to the growing tips. And they also have a reproductive system like we do, where in this case they're making grapes as their little babies. So it's just a way of starting to have a greater empathy, if you will, or sensitivity to what's going on with the plant, and guiding us in how we interact with the plants on our farms, regardless of which type they are. So I guess I still can't move the slides. There we go. Well, this is really getting specific, but I'm just going to touch on it really briefly because I think it's so such a profound aspect. This is especially true when growing perennials, but we know through some very interesting science about mycorrhizal fungi and their relationship to plants, and they're just one set of organisms that live in and colonize in the root zones of plants. But we also know that mycorrhizal fungi interact physically with plants by inserting their hyphate or their little tendrils into the root hairs of the plants, and they exchange mineral-rich water that they can create through enzymatic action with the carbohydrates that the plants can produce through photosynthesis. And we also know that these mycorrhiza can get really big, and they can interact with multiple plants at the same time, and they can help in the exchange of nutrients from plant to plant. And why this is something that really kind of gives me a thrill is that I have a vineyard that has thousands and thousands of vines in it, and they've been there now for dozens of years. And we've encouraged this growth and population of mycorrhiza that are now interacting with all our vines. And we see the real effect of this interaction through more uniformity of size in the vineyard, less hedging that's required, uniformity of color change in the grapes, uniformity of ripening, and more consistent chemistry of the fruit during ripening. And this would translate to other crops as well. It's just grapes are my example. So by treating the entire farm as a whole organism, by paying close attention to what's going on underground as well as to your crops above ground, you're really creating this life system that benefits in ways that we don't even imagine. It's pretty profound. And I did want to say, inserted at this point, this is biodynamic farming is a process, and it's interacting with processes. And from my experience, I found that we saw some effects, the first year, second year, but we saw some really profound effects year 5 and onward, where we saw changes occurring in our vineyards, and we found more resistant to diseases and changes in the actual structure of the vines. So this is a process, and the more you do it, really, the better it gets. Let's go to the next slide there. Yeah, this is an example of kind of how somebody was asking about the 500, which is the cow manure composted in the horns. This is an example from a friend of mine's work in Italy, where they compared lettuce growing in soils applied with and without the 500, which is the cow manure. And you can see on the left, healthy plants. On the right are the same plants, same variety, same soil, same farm, the difference being 3 applications of the cow manure. And you can see how it does enhance root growth and really stimulates the root activity. So that's pretty significant for any crop, I think. Let's look at the next one. Yeah, that's just another picture that just clearly illustrates the effect of the 500. Yeah, and this is also a nice one. This is in Montepulciano vineyard soils. The one on the left is a neighbor that has not applied 500, and on the right is after 5 years of applications. And you can see that the soil on the left is almost looks like a mineral substance, not very alive. On the right, there's great porosity. There's roots moving through the soil, creating all kinds of channels for nutrients and water. And the soil is just that much more alive. And, if you think about it, that much more oxygenated. And so many of the beneficial organisms that we want in our soil prefer oxygen environments to reductive environments. So it just has a building up of not only organic matter, but humus and this improved structure. Let's look at the next one there. Yeah, there's another. This is really heavy, clayey kind of soil with a lot of limestone particles, you can see, and it's the same effect with the 500. The left is no 500 on the 5, and the one on the right is after 5 years of the cow manure BD 500 applications. All right, let's go to the next one. This is very interesting, and I know there were questions about the silica spray, and I think this is the one that people have the most trouble kind of wrapping their brain around. Oftentimes people say, well, it must be kind of a reflective effect or whatnot. It really isn't. It's more, if I think of it as in allowing the plant to become more efficient in the absorption and use of sunlight. And you say how, and I don't know how. I'm a farmer, it's not my job to be a researcher, but I know that it has an effect and it works. So here are some pictures that kind of illustrate what's going on. And again, I'm going to use this vineyard as an illustration because that's what I do. So before, on the left, you can see there's a couple things going on. You can see the growing tendrils are kind of hanging over, and that's typical for vines. The growing tips are kind of a little droopy, and that's not because of water. That's because vines that's their gesture, the normal gesture. They're not self-supporting. In the wild, they grow up trees. They need the trees for support. The other thing that's significant about this photo on the left is you look at the leaf, the third leaf down, the bigger leaf, and it's kind of hanging. It's pointing to the ground. If you look at the photo on the right, which is 3 hours after the silica spray, I mean, the most obvious thing is the tendrils are just reaching for the sunlight. There's no mistaking that. It's really changed its structure. But also look at the leaf, third one down, how now it's starting to get more perpendicular to the ground, how it's like moving more like a solar panel. So it's moving perpendicular and getting more direct sunlight on it. And that's really significant in grape growing especially. Let's look at the next slide. I think there's another illustration of this. Yeah, you see the before and after. It's clear that you have this more of a reaching, more of getting positioned to be absorbing that sunlight. What's significant about this in vineyards, and I said earlier, we found that after multiple years of BD farming, we were having less disease pressure and just healthier vines. If you consider that grapevines in their natural state live up in trees, and what they really are striving for is a lot of air movement and sunlight. That's what they love. As when we grow them on trellises, we're creating a situation where they're all kind of bunched together, and we can have problems with mildews and molds growing in the canopy. So if you think about the effect of this 501 on the leaves, creating a situation where they're reaching to the sun, they're becoming more vertical, they're becoming more horizontal to the ground, and opening up the canopy. By doing that, it creates a situation where you get more airflow, more sunlight, and the vines are just happier that way, and there's less opportunity for molds and mildews. So this is just one way that we see this practice contributing to the health and eliminating conditions that are hospitable to the disease pressures that we might ordinarily have to combat. Let's look at the next slide here. Yeah, just another illustration of a vineyard in Tuscany, where you can see the leaves and the growing tips and the tendrils are all reaching for the sun, 3 hours after the application of that 501. So it's pretty profound. And to give you an idea, this is something, the 500 cow manure is something we spray in the spring to stimulate root activity and to kind of wake everything up, almost like a signaling molecule to the microbiome as well as the roots of the plants. The 501 is generally sprayed right around this time of year when you're getting peak sunlight and when you're getting the most rapid growth of these plants. So we'll spray it, as Evrett pointed out, early in the morning, and maybe several times as a mist over the leaf and canopy. Next one. Yeah, I'm beating you up with this illustration, aren't I? You can just see just the way, the gesture of those leaves, how they're more perpendicular and they're not hanging down. This is in Champagne. Let's look at the next slide. Yeah, this is an interesting one. We farmed 230 acres, and there's a couple aspects of this that I wanted to point out. One, when I got to Montanore, started working there in the 90s, I found, conventionally farmed and very compacted soils and vines that were very inconsistent in their growing patterns and shapes and sizes, and required a lot of extra labor for hedging and whatnot, inconsistent color change, very varied results at harvest in terms of fruit chemistry, and just created for a lot of extra work. So we converted initially to NOP organic, and then I was able to take a course in biodynamic practices and started doing biodynamic practices on the vineyards, and we had some really, really nice results. Initially, we saw fields that were, ho-hum, but on paper should have been great, starting to wake up and really fulfill what our expectations or their potential, if you will. So, but in saying that, I want to say that it really took a while. We had to keep doing this and be consistent and persistent. And one person asked, how do you know about, if you're getting results? One thing Steiner really emphasized, and he was a student of Goethe, who had a whole school of philosophy on colors and imaging and vision and all that. Steiner emphasized that we need to train our observational powers to be attuned to our farm so we can see how effective things are. And that sounds kind of out there, but you know what? You can do it, and it becomes a really, really effective tool. If you just stop and look look at the color, look at the gesture of your plants. You know, they'll start telling you things that maybe you might not have noticed before. And those powers of observation can be really powerful and extremely useful. There's the other aspect of this that I think is critical. I mean, we're all farmers and we all have to make a living. You know, what does this cost? I have found that over the years, it's been over 15 years since we started this, our farming costs have gone down relative to all of our conventionally farmed neighbors. On an average, we're anywhere from 20 to 25% lower on our per acre farming costs. And you know, we keep careful accounting at our place, and so do our neighbors, you know, so it's pretty remarkable. But I attribute that to what we're not spending money on. We're not spending money on herbicides. We're not spending money on expensive pesticides or fungicides. We're not spending money on fertilizers. And what we're getting is the effect of making the plants healthier and more resistant to disease pressure, and just making it a whole lot easier. And then also we're eliminating some of the practices we had to do. As I was saying earlier, we had inconsistent vine growth. Well, that meant we would have to take multiple passes through the vineyard with hedgers just to keep the canopy uniform, so we try to get uniform sunlight from vine to vine, so we'd have uniform ripening and uniform chemistry in the winery once it hit there. All those things kind of went away as the vines started evening out and becoming more uniform. We had a lot fewer passes on the hedging, and we didn't have to make all those passes going through at color change and clipping off all the green clusters. So there's an economical benefit to biodynamic farming, and it's a little bit of a leap of faith when you first start, but I can tell you from my own experience at Montanore, it really pays off financially in the end. Let's take a look at the next slide there. Well, yeah, we don't need to talk about the Willamette Valley. Wonderful place, good wines. That's another story. So let's go to the next one. Yeah, this is just a picture of our compost piles. In our set of circumstances, we have a lot of what would be considered waste product coming out of the winery, you know, grape skins and grape stems and all those things. And we utilize them in our compost piles, combining them with leaves off of deciduous trees that we get from the town of Forest Grove, as well as manure and bedding from local organic animal, you know, horse places or sheep and goats from neighbors, things like that. And into those compost piles, we add all the biodynamic preparations, and we end up making, you know, 300, 400, 500 tons of material every year. In the middle of the picture, that little yellow thing is a backhoe, so you can see how big the compost piles end up being. And we'll use it around the farm if we see weakness. You know, we see the nutritional need, and we average getting the entire farm covered with compost about every 3 years, so we stay in compliance that way. And a very interesting thing, those of you who are grape growers, these are all own-rooted vines that were planted in the early 80s, and we have phylloxera, and we've had spots where we've lost vines, but we have places where, through the use of compost, biodynamic compost, we are still harvesting those vineyards today, getting full crops and kind of living with the phylloxera due to the way we've enhanced the life of the microbiome in the root zones and feeding them through cover crops and compost. It's another whole conversation, but to tell you that we have 20 years of phylloxera-ridden vineyards that are still producing full crops, I think is fairly remarkable. So I just need to say that. Let's go to the next slide. Yeah, Evrett was pointing out that the stirring is very specific for the sprays of the 500 and the 501 and some other teas that we might put on too. Oftentimes people think of biodynamic farms as small. small acreage and everything's done by hand. We're too big for that. So we made our own stirring machines, where we can stir 300 gallons at a time with these big copper coated paddles and hydraulic motors and all that. So it can be done on a larger scale. You just have to get a little innovative. And I did want to say another thing that popped into my mind. These practices are not dogmatic and they may sound like it, but one of the things that Steiner really emphasized, he put a lot of emphasis on science and thought and thinking, and he almost chided people who took his directives as gospel. And he encouraged people to think through this, use your head, adopt these principles to your own set of circumstances, make them work in better ways. So he was open to change and development and evolution of these practices, within reason, as long as you're living with the standards. But I just wanted to point that out as well. And let's look at another slide here. And that is sunset on our happy vineyard. So at that point, I think I would just open it up to questions again.
Great, thank you, Rudy, for giving some case studies of the preparations in action, and also a little insight into how you've converted your farm into biodynamic. So we've had a number of questions come in during the presentation, and someone was wondering, beside the philosophical and moral incentives, are there any market incentives to farming biodynamically?
That is a very timely question. Being chairman of Demeter, I've been working very closely with the Biodynamic Association, and in Steiner's view of the world, he had this threefold economy, he called it. The three parts were culture, rights, and economy. Culture being education and all of that, rights being laws, rights, social justice, certification falls into that. And economy is economy, the marketplace. And in the biodynamic world, I think we've done well with culture and we've done well with rights, and we really stink at economy. So we've come together, both of our organizations, and right now we've proposed a unification of the Biodynamic Association and Demeter into a new organization. And when that happens, we're going to create the economic sphere, if you will, and in sort of general terms, a trade association, with the goal of getting the word out. I mean, it's almost like the best kept secret what we're doing here. Most people don't know what biodynamic means. They don't understand the value of the practices of the products. So as a community, we're really putting our focus on getting the word out, if you will. So from an economic point of view, I think that'll be powerful incentive to be engaging in this. The other, for economic point of view, is that, as I said, it's a economically advantageous set of practices. In my set of circumstances, I'm saving money on my farming costs, which go right into my product costs. So there's an advantage there. The other part of it is, you're working your farm in a way that at the end of every season, it's healthier than when you started at the beginning of the season. So you're building value of your farm. It's like you're building up a savings account in your soil. And we found that by doing that, the highs and lows really get mitigated. The droughty periods aren't so bad because there's more water holding capacity in the soil. The hot spikes, the vines and plants are doing okay. The cold periods, they seem to keep chugging along. So it kind of levels out the extremes and allows us to have more consistent results. So I think that those things are advantages to doing this, aside from the fact that it's just, how do I say this? It's just, if you're paying attention, it's just a beautiful thing to be farming and engaging in bringing life to a place. So there's that too.
Yeah, great. Thank you. We had another question come in wondering if you could shed some light on why organic wines require no SO2 additions, while biodynamic wines allow a minimum SO2 additions. And Everett, also feel free going forward to jump in on questions as well. But Rudy, since you're the wine expert, do you have any insight onto that?
Yeah, you're going to hear my prejudice now. I think that when the NOP standards were created for wine, some real purists had the day and said for some reason sulfur was an evil thing and it shouldn't be allowed in wine. People have been using small amounts of sulfur in wine since the Roman days because they recognize that it keeps it from spoiling and turning to the next product, which is vinegar. In Europe, they don't have that same standard and they allow low doses and which require very careful cellar management and all that. So biodynamic wine in Europe allows up to 100 parts per million total, which is not free. It's very different. It's total SO2 in the wine, whereas the NOP organic standard, which we followed when we created the biodynamic standard for the US, does not allow any added sulfur. So what we did in the US is we created biodynamic wine that mirrored the NOP standard. Then we created a category that does not exist in Europe, which is made with biodynamic grapes, which allows us to make wine according to the international standard. And we can say that it's made with biodynamic grapes on the label. So that's why there's that difference between the two.
Great, thank you. And we have another question come in, kind of wondering about the combined NOP and organic audits. So again, Evrett and Kelly, if you want to jump in at any point in the answer, feel free. And the question is, I've been through many NOP organic audits. It seems to me like an audit would be more intense if you're looking at more biological processes and preparations. I know it depends on the size and complexity of the operation, but can you tell us about how the audits work and if they're longer and more complex than the National Organic Program audits?
Well, I'd let Evrett handle that one since he has more experience there than I.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, the inspection is going to take a little longer. Like if you had just an NOP inspection and it took 3 hours and you add on a Demeter inspection criterias, then you're probably looking at maybe another hour. That's just general rough guess there. But a lot of these things go hand in hand, so it's not like you're going to have 2 tours or 2 sets of paperwork that you're going to be going through separately. A lot of these things happen at the same time. You're walking through the farm and you can see things and walking through the root cellar, and then if you have your biodynamic preparations stored there, you'll see them at the same time as you're looking at your root cellar storage facility. So a lot of the things happen simultaneously.
Great, thanks. And Kelly, do you have any insight you want to add from the organic certifier perspective? And just to note, we'll obviously be presenting the CCOF perspective, but as Evrett mentioned, there are many other certifiers that do combined audits.
Thank you. Yeah, this is Kelly. I'll just share that we make every effort to schedule inspections so that they are combined. So hopefully, like he was saying, you can walk through and cover both organic and biodynamic standards at the same time, but that isn't guaranteed. So we'll make every effort to do that, but finding someone who's both qualified for biodynamic inspections and organic inspections and that they're available within your timeframes is something we strive to make happen for you.
Great, thank you. So I think we're going to take one more question and then wrap things up. So for final question, someone was wondering if you can recommend some compost tea brewers or preparation preparers for those who can't do them on their own farm. Or where would you find this information?
Again, I would go to JPI, and one of my colleagues pointed out they're at jpibiodynamics.org, and they make preparations and they sell them. They have good material on the use thereof. They also have some other preparations that were developed by Ehrenfried Pfeiffer, who was a protege of Steiner, that I have found to be really effective, and you might want to explore that, and you can make teas out of that and spray them on different crops. So JPI is really a wealth of a resource.
Great, thank you very much. So we've come to our time, so I just wanted to thank Rudy, Evrett, and Kelly again for taking a little time out of their afternoon to give us a great overview of biodynamics. It's been a pleasure learning with all of you, and thank you very much. And again, if we didn't get to your specific question, we apologize. Evrett said that he would be happy to take follow-up questions, so I'll send out his contact information in the email that goes out to everybody with a recording of the presentation. So you'll have that coming in a couple days. It takes us a little while to get recordings up on our website. So just a few quick wrap-ups. I know some people were asking about more research on biodynamics, and Rudy had mentioned that that Steiner also mentioned that people should kind of test things out and do things that work on their operations. So here are just some links to peer-reviewed articles and references on biodynamic research. Just a few upcoming events. Next week, we're collaborating with the National Center for Appropriate Technology on a soil health webinar in celebration of Soil Health Day, so take a look at that. And thank you again for attending the webinar. We hope you found it informative, and please fill out your evaluation form that pops up after the webinar. There'll be a link for you to click, and it'll take you to the survey, so click on the link and answer a few quick questions, and we appreciate your feedback. It helps us put together new events and also improve our offerings. So thank you very much. Have a wonderful afternoon and take care and stay safe.